Good morning, kids, and welcome back to Children's Church, the virtual edition. I'm coming to you from a little bit of a different location, but we are still continuing on with our Joseph story. We are in the last part of that today, so buckle up. We've got a lot of things to cover. We need to do a quick recap of everything that we've learned so far in the story of Joseph.
So Joseph was one of 12 brothers. That's a lot of brothers. But he was his father's favorite son out of all of them. So his other brothers could not stand Joseph. They hated him. They hated him so much that they decide to capture Joseph and to sell him to be a slave in the country of Egypt. And they told their father that Joseph had died by a tragic accident, even though he hadn't. They had sold him as a slave. So Joseph is a slave in Egypt at Potiphar's house. And Potiphar really likes Joseph because God is with him and blesses everything that he does. But then Potiphar's wife ends up having a crush on Joseph. Nasty. Well, when Joseph wants nothing to do with it, she decides to lie and tell Potiphar that Joseph had attacked her even though he did nothing wrong, but really respected her and Potiphar and followed God and did the right thing. And so Joseph ends up being thrown into prison. And then through a series of events, which you have learned all about, Joseph ends up meeting Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh had had two weird dreams, and he asked Joseph to give him the interpretation, to tell him what they meant. And Joseph does that. And through all of that, Joseph ends up being second in command of all of Egypt. So Pharaoh elevates him to be the second in command to oversee everything that is happening in Egypt, particularly because there was a famine coming. Now, a famine is when there will be like really, really bad weather for a long time so that you wouldn't have enough food. So Joseph makes sure that before this famine starts, that Egypt collects enough food to be able to last them throughout this whole long famine.
And that is where the next part of our story will pick up. Egypt wasn't the only place that was experiencing this famine. As a matter of fact, Joseph's own family, his blood relatives who he hadn't seen in years, they lived in Canaan, and they were suffering from a lack of food, and they were scared that they were going to starve to death. So Jacob, who was Joseph's father, told his sons that they should go down to Egypt because he had heard that Egypt had food and was selling it off to different people. So he sent them with money to Egypt to buy food. But what he didn't know was that he was sending his sons to see Joseph, the son who he thought was dead, the son that they had sold into slavery. And they were going to have to ask Joseph to buy food from Egypt. We're picking up in Genesis chapter 42, verse 6. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves down before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. Right when Joseph was a younger kid, he had these dreams that his family would bow down before him. And right before Joseph's eyes, all these years later, on an unexpected day, his brothers were bowing down before him. It had come true. I don't know about you, but I just imagine Joseph like sitting on a throne of some sort, like this big oversized chair, and looking down at his brothers and being like, "No way, God, I can't believe this really came true. And my brothers are bowing down before me. We're not worthy. We're not worthy." It might have gone something like that. I don't know. Joseph certainly was not expecting to see his brothers on this day, or any day for that matter. And so he needs to think quick. And he decides that he is going to accuse his brothers of being spies. And so Joseph, since he's accusing them of being spies, he starts asking them lots of questions and starts finding out some vital pieces of information that he is dying to know. One of those biggest things that he has on his mind is the fact that Benjamin isn't with them. He sees that 10 of his brothers are there, but Benjamin, his full brother and youngest brother, was not there with him, and he wants to know what has happened to him. So he asks them all these different questions, and it comes out that they had left Benjamin behind because their father would not let him go with them, right? He was scared to death that something would happen to Benjamin if he went with his brothers. So he kept Benjamin behind. And that is where they said Benjamin was. But Joseph wasn't sure that he could believe his brothers. And just need to remind you that they have no idea this is Joseph that's talking to them. It's just some random guy that's really important in Egypt that has a lot of control and power and authority, and they're scared to death. Well, Joseph wants to make sure that his brothers aren't lying about Benjamin and that they haven't done anything to harm Benjamin like they did to harm him. So he sends them away except for one, Simeon. Simeon is put in jail, and he tells all of his brothers that if they want Simeon to be freed from jail, then they need to return with Benjamin, their other brother. Then he will believe their stories, and allow them all to go free. He gives them the food that they bought and sends them on their way back home. Just 9 people returning. Simeon is staying in jail. And remember, at this point, they had no idea that it was Joseph, their other brother, that was doing all of this. So they began their long trek back to Canaan with their bags full of food. But then on their way back, they realized something that was not good news at all. I mean, they had opened their bags and they found something inside that was not supposed to be there. Their money bags. The money that they had used to pay Pharaoh, well, Pharaoh's second in command guy, who was Joseph, that they didn't know was Joseph, that was returned into their bags. Would this man think that they had stolen the food? How could they ever return to Egypt now? They would all probably get thrown into prison. This is not good news. When the brothers returned, they told their father all that had happened, and he was greatly troubled. He was super, super sad because Simeon, his son, was now in prison. He had lost Joseph, now he lost Simeon, and he was sure that there was no way in the world that he was letting Benjamin go back to Egypt because he feared that Benjamin would be lost too. He had lost too many already. So they used the food that they had and went on with their lives for as long as they could survive. As you can imagine, the food only lasted for so long, and before you knew it, they had run out and they needed more food. So Jacob told his sons to go back down to Egypt and buy more food. But he didn't want to send Benjamin with them. And they were like, "Look, Dad, you don't understand. There is no way in the world that this man is going to sell food to us if we return there. If anything, it's only going to be worse." So eventually, Jacob allowed Benjamin to go with his sons for fear of all of their family dying from starvation. When the brothers returned to Egypt, they first saw a different Egyptian official, and they quickly began to explain to him that they didn't understand how that money had gotten back into their backpacks. They really didn't steal from them. They don't know what had happened, but the guy double-checked and said that they were fine, that the food was paid for. They didn't realize that Joseph had had that money returned to their backpacks, and so they were totally fine. And they were brought to Joseph, and there Joseph saw for the first time in so many years his youngest full brother, Benjamin. Benjamin was safe, he was alive, and he was well, and Joseph was just so happy. But he still didn't tell his brothers who he was. He had them invited for dinner that night, which I'm sure was very shocking to these guys. They must have been very confused as to why this man that was so important in Egypt would want to eat dinner with them, who he had like really accused and been harsh with so many times. But they all had dinner with him, Simeon included. Simeon got out of jail. And when the food was brought out, Benjamin was served like 5 times as much as all the other men because Joseph really loved him so much. But they didn't know that it was Joseph there at all. And when the meal was done, he sent them on their way back to Canaan. But what they didn't know was that Joseph was going to test them one last time to see if those brothers really did change. Not long after Joseph's brothers began their return journey to Canaan, they were stopped by some Egyptian guards who said that they had stolen a precious item from the king's court, from Pharaoh, from Joseph, I guess. And so they were like, what? We didn't steal anything. Are you kidding me? I mean, we were scared to death that you were going to accuse us of stealing the first time when we saw the money were in our bags, all that kind of thing. And so they're like, look, if anyone stole from you, you can put them to death if you so desire, because we did not steal a thing from you. So like, all right, well, let us check your bags. So one by one, the brothers stopped, unloaded their bags, and the Egyptian guards checked them. And one by one, they found nothing in them except for the food that they were supposed to bring back. Until finally they got to the 11th bag, the youngest, Benjamin, their father's now most beloved son, since Joseph he thought was dead. And when they undid his bag, they looked inside, and sure enough, they found the king's silver cup. Now, this cup isn't silver, but I think it gets the idea that this was a very valuable cup. And they were in disbelief and quickly needed to return. All the brothers needed to return to Joseph to beg for mercy. There had been some sort of mistake. There was no way that Benjamin had done this. Before long, they made it back to Joseph's house, which I'm sure looked a little bit nicer than that. But regardless, they come back and they are just overwhelmed, and they're so scared and nervous and worried as to what this man that is like Pharaoh, right? He's like second in command of all of Egypt, what he's going to do to them, since it looks like Benjamin, their youngest brother, had stolen from him. And quickly, Joseph says, and they still don't know this is Joseph, their brother, Joseph says that they are all free to go, except for Benjamin, because he was the one who had the silver cup in his bag, this very expensive, precious treasure of Egypt. But Judah, he speaks up, and he is scared to death, and he's bowing down before Joseph. And he says, please, if you would just listen to me, I'll explain why you can't take this son. See, our father, he had already lost one of our brothers. And now, if we were to come back without this one, he would be so sad that he would die. No, literally. It would kill him if we came back without Benjamin. And he said, please, if you would, sir, let Benjamin go free and take me instead. I'll stay here. I'll be your slave, your servant. And in that moment, Joseph was overwhelmed because he saw that his brothers, they had changed. And it seemed as though they were truly sorry for all of the harm they had done to Joseph. I'm gonna read straight from scripture this time because I don't wanna miss any details. There's a lot of great stuff that happens here. And really, I encourage you to go back into this story of Genesis, 39 through 46 or something like that. Joseph's life is so interesting, and there's so many details that I skipped over that are really important as well. I just didn't have enough time. So I encourage you to go back and read this story for yourself. But I'm reading from Genesis 45, starting at verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Can you imagine Joseph just crying and crying, overwhelmed with sorrow and grief and happiness and disbelief and all these different emotions, and his brothers just sitting there wondering what in the world is going on? When finally Joseph says this, verse 3, and Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They were in complete disbelief that this person claimed to be Joseph, their brother that they sold into slavery and they sold to Egypt. Verse 4, so Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and yet there are 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. Joseph quickly says to them, hey, I realize that you did this awful thing, but don't be worried. I'm not going to hurt you. And don't be angry with yourselves, because you got to realize here that God was in control this whole time. And even though you did this awful thing, God allowed all these things to happen so that I, Joseph, could allow there to be many, many survivors throughout this awful famine that was going to last many, many years. We were going to have enough food to survive, right? Because of Joseph being at the right place at the right time. Even though he probably felt like he was at the wrong place the whole time, it was exactly where God needed him to be. So it was not you who sent me here, Joseph says, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and that all you have do not come to poverty. Right? Joseph is reassuring them and saying to them, look guys, I'm like the king of Egypt now. I'm second in command to Pharaoh. He's given me so much control here. So you go back, get dad, get your wives and children and all of your families and bring them back to Egypt. And I will give you plenty of land where you can have food, and I will take care of you. This was probably just overwhelming news. Well, that is where our story is going to have to come to a close for today. We see Joseph later on, he gets reunited with his father and his brothers and all of their families. They all move down to Egypt where Joseph can take care of them and make sure that they have enough food for survival throughout this whole time of famine for the next 5 years. And Joseph, he shows that he just has a great perspective on life. He realizes that in the good, the bad, and the ugly, which Joseph experienced plenty of, that God was still in control through all of it. Genesis 50, verse 20 is just such a great verse where Joseph says to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me. Right? Exactly what they did. They wanted to harm Joseph. They were angry and jealous with him, so they sold him into slavery. As for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many should live, as it is true today, right? I might have messed up a few words in there. But God, he takes what the enemy, what people that are mean and bad and the awful things that happen in this world that aren't even responsible to people, just like bad things happen. He takes all of those things and he ends up working it for good so that he can be glorified and that others could know him. And we're going to sing a song about that right now. We're going to sing a short song that just reminds us that God always has the victory, that even when things seem like they're just could never go right and that this could possibly never turn out for good, that God is still at work and that in the end he will have the final victory and he's going to make all things right. And we are going to, if we are in his family, be with him in a perfect world for all of eternity. So if you know this song, then you can sing along with me. Whenever you catch on, just sing along. Ready? There's power in the mighty name of Jesus. Every war he wages, he will win. For the God I serve knows only how to triumph. Yes, I know how this story ends. Yes, I know how this story ends. I'm gonna see a victory. turn it for good. You turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. Let's sing that again. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. One more time. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. And I'm gonna see your victory. I'm gonna see your victory. For the battle belongs to the Lord. I'm gonna see your victory. I'm gonna see your victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. Nice job singing, everybody. Well, we are coming to a close right now, and before we leave, I want to leave you with 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of artwork. I don't know how many there were, but check out this great artwork from the dreams that we saw throughout the story. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. So I'll see you next week.